Hey guys, today we are going to talk about politics of the American founding. So I've posted your other lectures so far. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I've posted my email address. Gmail, of course, is the best way to reach me. I'm not really sure how to check the other email. I'm not sure where it goes. That being said, okay, so this week I've already posted your lecture on power and citizenship in the American politics, and then today we'll talk about politics of the American founding. Next week we will have a lecture on federalism and the U.S. Constitution, and we'll have our first quiz. The way we'll have that quiz set up is it'll just be a few questions posted on Blackboard, and you'll have a certain amount of time. I'll post the instructions for it, a certain amount of time to answer those questions and submit them. I don't give any extensions for quizzes, only because it's just a small thing that we do. So please make sure you get that turned in on time. The way your grade is calculated, we've talked about this before, but I just want to make sure you know, we have 4 quizzes, and that is 20% of your grade total. We'll have an essay that is 20% of your grade that you'll get towards the end of the semester. And then each exam, you have 3 exams, and they are 20% each. That's 60% of your grade. So that's where that all comes from. Okay, so today we're talking about politics of the American founding. Governments depend for their authority on people believing that their power is legitimate. So when that legitimacy is challenged, their authority also is. It's a growing movement for example, Cliven Bundy was trying to take over a wildlife refuge in Oregon in 2016. He was supporting rangers who were arrested for arson on federal land, but those rangers didn't support Bundy's group. Bundy demanded the land be given back to the state, who was owned by the federal government, didn't want to cause a shutdown. Various militias joined together. Anyway, the surrender, it took almost 2 months to end. This reflected a growing movement at the time. The federal government abusing the power of the Constitution and saying the power must be returned to the citizens. That was a growing movement then. Also, Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. That was the bloodiest incident in the insurgent movement. And then, of course, January 6th of last year was another insurgent movement where they had the attack on the Capitol. How should the federal government respond to challenges to its legitimacy? Where do we draw the line between sounding off against an elected official and advocating for a violent protest? Many British subjects came to America to make money, to practice religion without interference, and to become landowners. But they were rebelling against their government. A useful way to understand who had power in the colonies is to look at the rules regulating political participation. So who was allowed to vote in colonial lawmaking bodies, who wasn't, why. Each colony had its own voting rules based on religion, property, gender, race, etc. In the earliest colonial days, the tightest requirements for voting were moral or religious qualifications. Northern colonies wanted to keep the ungodly out of the government. In 1640, there were religious tests for voting, and that prevented 3/4 of the Massachusetts population from having any political power. But by 1691, they moved closer to Virginia's view that based worth on wealth instead of character. Then property. Conventional British wisdom, if you're not a property owner, you don't care about government. Colonies began to think this way too, and they required voters to be property owners or later taxpayers. What about gender? Sometimes women could vote in England if they satisfied the property requirement, and there were no voting males in their household. There were maybe widows or daughters who had inherited property, etc. They could vote in church meetings, but this was eventually excluded in America after the Revolution. And then race. At first, African Americans were subject to the same laws as Europeans, but the need for cheap labor took over. And of course, slavery, or the ownership or forced labor of one people by another, became accepted, and their rights became stripped. Okay, so the split from England. The relationship of colonial America and England that bound them together was accepted as normal. Americans were obligated to make England their primary trading partner, and all goods passed through England where they were taxed. There were some benefits to this. They had the financial support of British corporations, military defense, secure market for agricultural products. Those all generally outweighed the burdens of this obligation. Colonists began to develop an identity as an American, but not as an English transplant anymore, and so they thought of this British presence as intrusive. They tried to fix it instead of ending it. The French and Indian War was a war fought between France and England from 1754 to 1763 that resulted in France's expulsion from the New World, which put Britain really deeply in debt. And they turned to the colonies at this point to help pay for their defense. They levied taxes on the colonies and tried to enforce more than trade laws to increase British profits from the American resources. But colonies were free of Spanish, French, and Indian threat now after this, and so they no longer needed this British protection, and they could afford to resist the British efforts to help make them pay for it. So the Tea Act of 1773, of course, is when they hurled 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor in the infamous Boston Tea Party. Britain, of course, responded by passing the Coercive Acts of 1774, which were designed to punish the citizens of Massachusetts, but unknowingly sowed seeds of revolutions. So there were these philosophical ideas flourishing in England and European Enlightenment. John Locke. They also started flourishing in the colonies in the United States. The colonists, so the British had this sovereign law that Parliament was the established rule of law and constitutional principles. Why can't I say that? The colonists rejected this in favor of popular sovereignty, that government belonged in the hands of the people, that British colonial authority seemed illegitimate to the colonial elite, taxation without representation. Though British had offered Americans representation in Parliament, they rejected it. But it wasn't just the taxation that was objectionable, it was the British authority itself. Popular sovereignty, of course, the concept that citizens are the ultimate source of political power. So, Revolution time. In 1774, the First Continental Congress, they declared these coercive acts void. They planned to stop trade with England, and they called for another meeting next year. But before that meeting, the King's Arm arrested Sam Adams and John Hancock and discovered weapons. Paul Revere, of course, roused the first shots at Lexington and Concord, and the revolution began. Story passed by word of mouth, not by social media, guys. Could be controlled easily. People who stood to gain the most were those with property who were translating, and most others couldn't read, so it was easy to control the narrative here. Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet in 1776 called Common Sense. It persuaded many Americans to support the revolutionary cause. It went viral at the time, sold about 150,000 copies in a few weeks, and it called for the rejection of the king, for independence, and for Republican government. In 1776, the Continental Congress met, and Thomas Jefferson wrote a Declaration of Independence from England. Thomas Jefferson was brilliant, and this document is really proof. The Declaration of Independence, of course, is the political document that dissolved the colonial ties between the United States and Britain. John Locke said that government is based on a contract between the rulers and the ruled. The ruled agreed to obey the laws, as long as the rulers protect their basic rights to life, liberty, and property. And if this fails, they can break up and form a new government, which is exactly what the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence says, except for he changed property to the pursuit of happiness so he could get more people on board. They didn't point fingers at Parliament. They did share some of the blame, perhaps because they knew they were kind of going to form their own Parliament here. Or perhaps they didn't recognize Parliament's authority over them, so King George really got the wrath here. Do you think there's any circumstances in which it's justifiable today for groups of the United States to rebel against the federal government? In the Constitution, the phrase that all men are created equal, John Locke explains that equal doesn't necessarily mean equal. Age, virtue, excellency, merit, etc. can change the definition. Men are equal in a natural sense, but society establishes dimensions where they're unequal. For example, he did not endorse but also did not condemn slavery, much like the founders. Jefferson blamed King George for the institution of slavery in the original draft of the Declaration, which was interesting for a man who owned slaves and wrote on behalf of many slave owners. It was a very politically confusing and morally ambiguous time. That passage was eventually deleted. All right, so let's skip down to the Articles of the Confederation. In 1777, the Continental Congress met to create a new government. The Constitution are the rules that establish a new government. The Articles of Confederation are the first Constitution of the United States in 1777, created an association of states with a weak central government. They set up a firm league of friendship among the 13 states, but it didn't empower a central government or act effectively on their behalves. This was ultimately replaced because they needed a strong central government to provide economic and political stability. The Confederation is a government in which independent states unite for a common purpose but retain their own sovereignty. States are their own, and the central government is only there to run the collective business of the states. This was founded on state authority, but it says nothing about individuals. No rights or obligations for citizens. This is to be handled by the states. States were 13 independent units. They each had their own currency, their own laws, their own tariffs. These Articles of Confederations, of course, ended up failing. They were very weak. The future of the United States was really up in the air at this point. There was no effective central government, and they couldn't conduct business with any other countries at this point. So popular tyranny is the unrestrained power of the people. In a monarchy, you fear the unrestrained power of the king, but in a republican government, you fear the unrestrained power of the people. Shays' Rebellion in 1787 was a grassroots uprising by armed Massachusetts farmers that were protecting foreclosures. It really scared and embarrassed leaders of the United States. They were scared that their grand experiment in self-government was failing. They had to find a way to contain and limit the will of the people in a government that was going to be based on the will of the people. Who won and lost under the Articles of the Confederation? Of course, even before Shays, the delegates met in Annapolis to discuss some commercial weaknesses. They asked each state to send delegates to a national convention to be held in Philadelphia in 1787. This was the Philadelphia Convention. They tried to fix the Articles of Confederation, but they didn't want to save it. So then they had the Constitutional Convention, where 55 delegates came together in the summer of 1787 to completely recast the Articles of Confederation. And of course, the result was our Constitution. This replaced, not revised, the Articles. And some delegates took this to mean that the convention was overthrowing the government. The delegates here were some of the most educated, powerful, and wealthy citizens of the United States at the time. They were impressive. They were the cream of society. They were very well educated when most were not. They were wealthy when most were not. Mostly young, but politically experienced in revolutionary politics, very well read on political theories of the day. They were the cream of society. Imagine you can create your own government from scratch, create all the rules to your own liking, but you have other delegates to work with. Some who want a big, strong government. Some who are fearful of a big government. There's a compromise here, and that's called federalism. It's a political system where power is divided between the central and regional units. Unlike a confederation where states retain the ultimate power, federalism gives the central government its own source of power, the Constitution, over the people, but also independent power to the states. Federalists are supporters of the Constitution who favored a strong central government. Anti-federalists, of course, are advocates of states' rights who oppose the Constitution. All right, so they worked that out. Now they have to decide how to allot power among the states. All the states, should they all be the same? Should bigger states have more power than smaller states? There were two plans to resolve this issue. The Virginia plan was a proposal at the Constitutional Convention that the congressional representation be based on population, thus favoring the large states. Virginia plan was favoring the large states because Virginia was a large state. It was created by James Madison. He proposed the country would have a strong national government run by a bicameral, bi meaning two, bicameral two-house legislature, one house directly elected by the people, one indirectly by the combination of state legislatures and popularly elected national house. The numbers would be determined by the taxes paid by the residents of the state, which represented the free population of the state. Large states would have more representatives in both houses, and national law would be weighted in their favor. Okay. This had a problem, though. Of course, three large states like Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania could form a majority and carry all legislation their way. They also called for a single executive to see that laws were carried out in a national judiciary to be appointed by the legislature and gave national government power to override state law. That was the Virginia plan. The New Jersey plan, New Jersey's a small state, so they made a proposal at the Constitution that the congressional representation be equal, thus favoring small states. Reinforcement of the Articles of Confederation. They wanted a multi-person executive, so not one president, but lots of presidents, so not one person could possess too much power. They wanted congressional acts to be the supreme law of the land. They wanted a unicameral, meaning one, unicameral house, and each state having only one vote. They wanted delegates to be chosen by state legislatures. Small states could block what large states wanted, and even though large states had more people and they could contribute more revenue. It's a tough compromise here, but they did compromise in what's called the Great Compromise, which was the constitutional solution to congressional representation. You get equal votes in the Senate, votes by population in the House. They kept most of the framework of the Virginia plan. They had a strong federal structure to be headed by a central government with sufficient power to tax the citizens, regulate commerce, excuse me, conduct foreign affairs, organize the military, and exercise central powers. This called for a single executive, one president, and a national judicial system. They provided for 2 houses, but the House of Representatives was based on state population, giving large states the extra clout. But in the Senate, each state has 2 votes, giving smaller states more power in the Senate than in the House. This is the way it is still today. The House was elected by the people, the Senate by state legislatures, which does change later, and we elect all of it by the people now. Legislation would have to be approved by both houses, so neither the large nor small states could hold the entire country hostage, and this is still true today. All right, so we've worked these other compromises out. The next one is slave owners and non-slave owners at odds about how population was to be determined for purposes of representation in the House. Ooh, that sun just got in my eyes. Let's see if I can move this around a little bit. Southern states wanted to count slaves as if, though they had no intention of actually giving them the right to vote, but Northern said that if slaves couldn't vote, they shouldn't be counted. So they compromised with what's called the 3/5 compromise, which was the formula for counting 5 slaves as 3 people for the purposes of representation, which reconciled Northern and Southern factions at the Constitutional Convention. Ratification is the process by which a proposal is formally approved and adopted by vote. Constitution was eventually ratified by all 13 states, but there were a lot of political battles that had to be fought first. You had the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. Of course, the Federalists were mostly men with considerable economic stake in the new nation who had fared poorly under the Articles. They had security and order as their key values and popular control. They wanted good government designed with underlying principles of human behavior to be known. If people were ambitious and tended toward corruption, government should produce this to produce a good outcome. Far more aggressive. Federalists were a lot more aggressive in the media. They hit a lot of New York newspapers with editorials written by Publius, aka Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. These essays were bound and distributed elsewhere. They were known as the Federalist Papers, which you guys are reading some of right now. They are a series of essays that were written to build support for the ratification of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists rejected the notion that if ambition and corruption were inevitable parts of human nature, government can be kept small and local. Americans could be happy without getting involved in politics. Americans shouldn't stray too far from their rural roots and values, and they could avoid creeping corruption that was threatened under it. They published essays under names like Cato, Brutus, and the Federal Farmer. But the Federalist Papers were 85 essays that were very well thought out and logical, but tricky and persuasive. In Federalist number 10, for example, James Madison tried to convince Americans that a large country was no more likely to succumb from the effects of special interest than a small one. He said the greatest danger comes from factions. Factions are groups of citizens united by some common passion or interest and opposed to the rights of other citizens or the interests of the whole community. So, for example, farmers want to keep the price of food high, but it would make most Americans worse off. Businessmen want high import duties that would make things more expensive for the rest of us. Madison relied on mechanical elements of politics, size and representation, to remedy a flaw in human nature, the tendency to form divisive factions, which is typical of Federalist approach to the government. Do you think we still do that today? In Federalist 84, written by Hamilton, he argued against a Bill of Rights. And it was because of this that the Constitution was ratified. It was a summary of citizen rights guaranteed and protected by government. It added to the Constitution the first 10 amendments in order to achieve ratification. Some state constitutions had a Bill of Rights and had argued that they'd be redundant, but Hamilton said it was unnecessary and even dangerous to include them in the Constitution because the limited national government couldn't interfere with citizen lives in many ways, and any interference would be suspect. If the Constitution was prefaced with a list of things the government could not do, then individuals would assume it had the power to do anything that wasn't expressly forbidden. It ended up being more of a bill of limits on the federal government, and it was added as the first 10 amendments. So, citizenship at this point was a fledgling creation at our founding. We were not subjects of a crown anymore. Citizens do have rights and obligations, but citizenship does not confer equal rights. Principle clashed with prejudice. We can be appalled at the failure of founders to practice principles of equality, but we need to remember that citizenship was a new concept back then, and what they created was far more democratic than what they'd seen previously. The purpose of government is to protect our rights, and the Constitution guarantees Americans freedoms of speech and assembly, but the government needed to hold the monopoly on the legitimate use of force in society, or it would fall like the British government fell to American colonies. So we permit legal ways of getting involved. We can vote, we can run for office, we can change laws, we can amend the Constitution. We wanted to prevent rise of groups like Cliven Bundy that I started out with, or the insurgency on January 6th last year that promotes violence, that intended to promote political stability, but not by revolution. But how do we draw the line between the protection of individual rights and the exercise of governmental authority? We want to respect the rights of all citizens, but this can be thwarted when a small number of individuals reject the rules of the game agreed upon by the majority. So the two questions I want you to think about after today's lecture, again, you don't have to email these to me, but I do want you to think about them. How should the federal government respond to challenges against its legitimacy? Where do we draw the line between sounding off and against an elected official and someone who advocates for violent protest? And then second, are there any circumstances where it would be justifiable for groups in the United States to rebel against the federal government today, the way we did against the British colonies, or against British when we were colonies? All right, so think about that. And then, of course, I will be back next week with your lecture on, where did it go? Federalism in the United States Constitution. And then we'll have our first quiz. Email me if you have any questions, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.